How does one go about reading a classic book? Are you one of the thousands of people who every year think to themselves, I really would like to read more classics. I really want to expand my reading, and I know that there's some great stuff in there that stood the test of time, but you're held back by your own self-doubt, or maybe you feel a little bit intimidated by the reputation of the classics. You may think you need a degree or to be an academic in order to read the classics, or you're worried about their size or their long-winded writing which you may expect is in them. Well, if that's you, this video is designed just for you and has come about by the amount of people in my Patreon community who have told me that they worried so much about reading the classics for those reasons, only to discover that the classics are actually quite straightforward to read. They are thoroughly enjoyable, and they've begun to understand that why the classics have become the classics that they are, why they stand out from the crowd. So in this video, I'm going to take you through several points which will help you to take away any self-doubt, which will bring the classics down off their pedestal, and also help you create a reading idea that will suit your personality and will almost guarantee you'll enjoy the classic books that you read. So, having said all that, grab yourself a cup of tea and then let's dig in, shall we? Our first point is that the classics all started as books for the ordinary person. All the classic books you see, with maybe one or two exceptions, were written for the everyday person. For enjoyment, for entertainment, for a thrill, to move someone to tears or to make them laugh or to give you a sense of adventure and daring do. Think of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, a famous classic book. It's not hard to read. It's a story about an orphan child who ends up in the wicked parts of London and his little story and how he's saved. It changed the world, but who read it? It was all of the commoners of England that read that book. But it was so good, it started spreading abroad and being read by everybody else. Émile Zola wrote a book called Germinal. The working class loved that book. They carried it at his funeral, his state funeral in France. Ordinary people read those books. When they were first written, they weren't classics, but they're so good, so engaging, that they've lasted generation after generation and are now called classics. They're studied because they were so good at what they did, but they weren't written to be good. They were written to entertain. So this first point should be the biggest one for you. Classics are not intimidating. They are just books written to entertain the ordinary person. The reason they've become classics is simply they're really good at what they do. They're so good that others seek to emulate them. With that in mind, the second point on our guide should be an obvious one, and it's this: read what interests you. Whatever style of book or genre you like in film or reading, there will be classic versions of that which have lasted the test of time. And all too often, when people get into reading the classics, they think, I have to read the Brothers Karamazov, this deep, brooding, thoughtful argument by Dostoevsky. Or I need to read War and Peace, the great sweeping, mind you, very entertaining, sweeping saga by Tolstoy. Or it needs to be some great tome like Les Miserables at 1,300 pages. That's not necessary. What happens if you like sci-fi? Well, none of those books are science fiction. But you may be interested in H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, for instance. You most certainly would probably find Jules Verne exceptionally interesting to read, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Why not start there? Or perhaps you're interested in mysteries or in detective fiction and you like a good crime thriller. Well, why not go back to Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes? Or maybe pick up a Daphne du Maurier and read her. The book Rebecca is absolutely fantastic. You will love that book. Or The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, a book I recommend to anyone because I'm so confident people will just enjoy it. And again, there are lots of different genres that you could go to. It could be historical fiction, in which case you might want to look at something like Les Miserables, or you may want to look at something like Ben-Hur by Lew Wallace if you're into the Romans. So pick what interests you. And when you get a classic within that genre, just look around the internet, you'll find ones that are recommended. You'll probably find you thoroughly enjoy it because they were written for the ordinary person for entertainment and have become established as icons of their genre. The third point on our guide is one not many people think about, and it is know why you are reading. You see, we often look up how should I read to be a better reader? What classics should I read? As if there are best ones to start with. But we often don't look at why am I reading the classics? Now, this is really important. If you're reading to be entertained, then know that you'll be reading to be entertained. You don't need to dig deep into them, look for hidden meanings and symbology and all that kind of stuff. Just read to get the thrill that all the people in history got when they first read these books when they came out. That's good enough. But you may want to read the classics for a different reason. You may want to read because you would like to understand how writing works, because you like the idea of writing for yourself. In which case, look up books which are known to be good in style. It's not hard to find, you just Google it. Or maybe you're reading because you want to be more familiar with a particular time period. So instead of reading Dombey and Son and War and Peace, if you're reading because you want to get to know all of the great Greek classics, then read the Greek classics. And maybe read books which are retellings of those old Greek fables. Just write down what it is you want to get from reading, and then attune your mind to that before you start reading. That's all you need to do, and keep going back to that one point. Because sometimes if you're reading for entertainment but then find yourself trying to read the deep, meaningful, philosophical, mind-bending literature that some people say you must read in the classics, well, you're not going to enjoy it. So don't do it. But if you love the psychological, you want to get into the Russians, and that's why you're reading, then by all means read all of the Russians. Why not? The fourth point on our guide into reading the classics is quite an obvious one, and yet people feel guilty when they think of it. And it is start with shorter works. Not all classics, in fact the majority of classics are not massive. Yes, there are some tomes, yes they are brilliant, but some of the shortest works are the best ever written. For instance, The Great Gatsby is classed as one of the best novels of the 20th century, and it comes in at what, 110 pages? One of my favourite writers, Somerset Maugham, this is The Painted Veil. I love this book, and it is, well, what is it? I'll just get the page number. 215 pages. You know, there's not much to it. Yet what comes in the story is so moving. Another one of my favourite writers, Balzac, Eugénie Grandet. This may look big, but it's not. The type in this is actually rather large. And this book only runs to 230 pages. The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a foundational piece of American literature, is a really short read. And I'm currently reading with the Patreon community Kokoro, which is a Japanese classic, and it itself is only 221 pages long. And yet they're brilliant, brilliant stories. Now, if you're already someone who reads a lot anyway, then you might find that Les Mis is not intimidating. You might just think, well, 1,300 pages, I read regularly every day, I'll get through it. If you're just setting out on the classics and you're not a big reader, why not set a reasonable target of something like 200 pages just to start? And using our second tip, read what you enjoy. So pick a genre that you think you're going to enjoy and find a reasonable sized book. Getting a few of those under your belt will demystify the classics altogether. You'll just think these are just great stories that anyone can read. I don't know what all the fuss was, what all the nerves was about approaching the classics. The fifth point in our guide to reading the classics is take a break if you need to. Sometimes because we know that the great literature can do us a load of good, a bit like eating sprouts and broccoli, we feel we have to keep forcing it down our throats. We don't. Remember why you're reading. If your reading is purely for enjoyment, which is, the most noble of all of the reasons for reading, I think, then when you don't want to read any more classics and you want to read something more up to date or just watch movies for a couple of weeks, take a break. There's nothing wrong. The classics were never written by their authors to be used in school, in universities. They were written to entertain. They wanted to speak something into the world and for people to grab it and love it and appreciate it. They didn't want them to have to read it. That's a bit like you wouldn't want to be in someone's company if they were tolerating you, would you? You'd rather leave and let them be to themselves. I don't think any great writer ever wanted people to be made to read them. And so when you feel fatigued, don't add to the pressure. Don't turn classics. That develops a mindset of the classics being intimidating. They become taskmasters. You have to work with me. You have to read me. Otherwise, there's something deficient about it. Nonsense. When you're tired, take a break. If you want to watch a film, watch a film. That's absolutely fine. And it also brings us on to point number 6. You've already guessed what point number 6 is. Watch a film based upon the classics. Some people don't like to watch a film before they've read the book, and that's fine. But that's not necessarily the right way. There is no right way. Sometimes you may want to watch the film of a classic, let's say Great Expectations, and then if you enjoy the film and you've got an idea of the story, read the book. Some may think, well, I know the story, so I don't need to read the book now. Let me just say one thing about that. The book is always better than the film in this sense, that you get to hear the narration, and there's a lot of inward thinking that goes on through narration that causes you to build the scene. Most books, the stories would take longer than the average 2 hours for a film to cover. And so films often miss points out of the book, and sometimes the best scenes in the book are not actually in the film because it's the director's choice what to pick. But nonetheless, feel free. It's not a sin to watch the films of some classics before you even read them. You may hate the film so much you don't want to go near the book. That's fine, isn't it? Because we want to read what appeals to us. Tip number 7 in our guide to reading the classics is one I don't really hear that often, and it's this. Make sure you read classics from your own culture and in your own mother tongue. What I'm not saying here is that you don't read other classics from other cultures. That's not what I'm saying. But frequently, when the majority think about the classics, they do think of predominantly the English classics and the Russian classics and a couple of the French classics. Throw in there Don Quixote from Spain as well. They're the ones most people think of. I think there are some people I know who are from Italy who have read more English classics than Italian classics. Read in your mother tongue. If someone wrote in your mother tongue, you will get nuances and meanings and depth that's built into your culture that someone reading a translation will never get. And it will be more easy and natural to you than you realise as a native speaker of the language. But by all means, get translations and read other cultures. I do. I read from all over the world. I just showed you Kokoro, which is Japanese. Wonderful book. Absolutely loving it. And yet I can imagine reading it in Japanese would be even more rewarding. So don't feel you have to read certain works amongst the classics, as if you have to read certain ones of the Russians, certain ones of the English. Read from your own culture as well, because you will have brilliant, brilliant stories from your own culture. The 8th point on our guide to reading the classics and enjoying them is to take a bit of time to think about what you've read. That can be thinking while you're in the journey of reading a book and after you've finished. A big mistake we all fall into, I know I count myself in this, is we imagine if we had read 100 classics in 1 year, how much we would know and appreciate, and we'd be we're full of wisdom and sage ability to talk about a book. That's not true. I'd rather read 20 books in a year and think about them and dwell in them and linger upon them and get to know their multifaceted sides just the way it affects me than read 100 back to back and not have time to think. So when I'm reading, I'll frequently, even if I haven't finished the book, when I'm on a walk, I'll be talking to myself. I'll be going over just the story. I'll retell the scene to myself, and sometimes it helps me remember the names of characters. And I have questions, and I begin to, play guess the plot, and I wonder if this person will actually be a baddie. You get that hunch sometimes, or wouldn't it be funny if they were a good guy and not a bad person? And other times at the end of books, we've talked in my Patreon community about one of the cornerstones for reading literature is, how does this book behave similarly to my life today? Just asking that one question can give you a great sense of satisfaction in a book. It suddenly takes on a multitude more colours. But whatever you decide to think about it, just make sure you take the time to think. And one of the things that could really be a separate point here, but I'll just throw it in on this one, is if you don't know how to think about a book, you've not really done that before, it's the same as if you talk to someone. Just discuss a book with someone that's read it as well, and you watch how much more you get out of the book, how much more joy you get out of the book. They will say things that will make you respond. That's what conversation is. And you begin to see the book with so many more touches of colour and light and sparkle and dazzle and pizzazz. So talk about it. That's another way of thinking about a book, and that will take your reading to a whole new level. And you will find, with all of these tips put together, that the classics are easy, thoroughly enjoyable, addictive, certainly not imposing or intimidating. They're just great books to read, and you'll feel so much satisfaction as you read them. Now, at this point, you may be wondering whether I'm going to recommend any specific books to get started in the classics. Not in this video. This video is purely a guide to how to read them, how to get into them, I should say. If you want a guide, subscribe and like this video, because next week I will be talking about various classic books from different genres, so that it may give you a sense of some of the books you may want to start with in your own classics reading journey. If you've appreciated this video and you'd like to support the channel, by all means come over to my Patreon community and sign up for a month or so there, where you'll get exclusive content and we talk about books together. Or if you just want to make a small contribution on my Buy Me a Coffee page, everything you give to support this channel really, really is appreciated, and I thank you very, very much. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever classic you decide to read.